Hey there, this video is on the command pattern and how you can use it to increase flexibility and reduce complexity in some areas of your game. So let's get stuck in. Traditionally, you could have your trigger and action in the same function, like if a key is pressed, space, then jump. You might have all that in the same block of code. But if you separate out that action and encapsulate it inside its own class, the idea with the command pattern then is that you can switch out any of these actions for the same trigger. So it's like remapping on a keyboard. If you click space, you could get it to do the original jump, or you could get it to do a slightly higher jump, or you could get it to move you forward. Then that becomes a really nice thing. It just means that we can pretty much get anything to happen when anything happens. And let's look at a use case for the command pattern, as simply as we can. So here I've just got a little capsule on the floor. You can run around with WASD and jump with spacebar. And the code for this is really simple as well. I've got a game controller which has a public game object for the player. I then spin up this player controller class, pass in that game object and update that every frame. The player controller in its update function just listens for WASD and space, and for each one of those it'll do like moving the position of the player or adding some force to this player's rigid body. So that's all good and well, but now we've decided we want a tutorial to teach players how to play. And this tutorial consists of temporarily changing the player's input, such as just allowing you to run around and not jump, and then followed by just allowing you to jump and not run around, to make sure you get used to each section of those controls. So how could we do that then? We could have maybe a state to this player controller, and we could put it in a tutorial movement state, which just allows you to do that, a tutorial jump state, which just allows you to do the bottom one, or a full state. The downsides of that then are the tutorial code is cluttering up our player controller. We could have a huge 20-hour game where we're moving this player around, and the class that's responsible for moving this player around has tutorial code in it that's responsible for the first 2 minutes of gameplay, which doesn't seem right. That could interfere with the remainder of the regular movement code. And it also feels a little bit messy to put those two together in the same class. So what can we do? So if we look at what we've already got, we've got a trigger from each one of these for getting the input. Is this key down? And we've got actions, which are the things inside the functions. So based on this trigger, this action happens. So we want to encapsulate this action inside a command, its own class, so that we can switch these out for dummy ones for a tutorial. So let's create a command class. We'll call it input command. There's no need for it to be a mono behaviour. It can instead be an abstract class that can't get instantiated on its own. And the only function it's going to have is just to be able to execute. So when that command's called. So first let's look at a move forward command that implements the input command that we just created. And if we implement that inside our execute function, we want to do what we had in the player controller W callback. So we just copy and paste that in. And we're missing the player game object and the speed, but we can pass the player game object in as a constructor to this. And expose that speed constant. So the idea being now that we can get this move forward input command to trigger there. So if at the top of the class we create a input command member, call it move forward, and we'll assign that to a new move forward command, pass in the player, and here we can just now switch this out for move forward dot execute. This of course does the same thing as before, you can move forward, but we haven't gained any functionality yet. So what we can do is create a further input command. We'll call this one a dummy input command, and this one is going to implement the same abstract class, but when it executes it's not going to do anything. We're just going to leave an empty execute function there. So if we go back into our player controller, we could instead assign this move forward command to a new dummy input command. So when we press the W key now, we're going to execute the move forward command, which is now set to a dummy, which has done the equivalent of turning off that input. That can no longer move forward. Okay, so if we quickly create something similar for the other types of movement input. Now we can create some new commands, one for each of the other keys. All our input's still working, great. So now the nice simple bit, if we just want to turn off our movement input, all we have to do is for each one of these assign them to the dummy input that we created earlier. So in our game controller, after we've created the player, we could then say player controller dot disable movement. And now we can't move around at all anymore with WASD. And you can imagine using this in a tutorial where you need to turn on and off input to teach the players different actions. So let's have a look at that jump. And if in this function, rather than thinking about tutorials, how about we think about upgrades? So at the moment we had a force of 2.5 whenever we click the space bar. And if we do what we've done before and wrap this inside a command, cut the short jump, and if we do the same thing again, where we take in the player game object, from this we can get the rigid body on the player, and when we execute it we'll do the same jump as before. Now before we continue, how about we create a copy of this for a higher jump. Set this to be 5. Okay, so back in our player controller, if we do what we used to by now, we can create another input command for jumping, and we can initially assign this to our short jump command. And if we take this for a spin, getting the single jump like you'd expect, but when we expose the ability to upgrade our jump, we can unlock that from game controller. When we play this now, we should be able to jump much higher. Yeah. So this has encapsulated all the player movement and jumping controls that we had. It's quite cool now because we can assign any of these to any of the other keys. We could completely remap across the keyboard. We can have multiple behaviours for move forward or move backwards, again if we upgrade. And as I've talked about a lot, it can be really handy for tutorials without messing up the rest of your code base. So I hope you enjoyed that and you can find somewhere to try it out in your game. I'll see you next time.